India under quote unquote the billionaire Raj is more unequal than it was under the British Raj. That is the dramatic claim made in a new report placed in the public domain by the World Inequality Lab. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Today we're looking at a new paper that has been published by the World Inequality Lab that makes a startling and a powerful claim. The report says that the billionaire Raj, that is how the report and the authors of the report describe it, the billionaire Raj that defines India today is more unequal than the country was under the British colonial Raj. The report goes on to place several data points in the public domain to make the argument that India's inequality has been on the rise, and it is the middle class, not the wealthiest and not even those at the bottom of the economic totem pole, but the great Indian middle class that has been the hardest hit by this rising inequity. Now, how do we make sense of these figures at a time when the government is talking about an 8% GDP growth? That figure has been endorsed by banks like Barclays that have called India an 8% growth economy. India is set to be the third largest economy by 2027. How does those data points reconcile with what the World Inequality Lab has found in its report? Let's introduce one of the authors of the report, our newsmaker on the program today. Anmol Somanchi is with us. Anmol, thank you so much for your time. And it is a dramatic and a startling claim. And this is the sentence that really leaps out from the report. Billionaire Raj today makes India more unequal than British colonial Raj. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to this conclusion? Not so much as methodology, because I'm not an expert, but just this big conclusion that you've arrived at. Could you talk a little bit more about this?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Barkha. Yes, I think that's kind of the key headline for us, that the way economic inequality stands today in India, it's more unequal than perhaps it was under the British rule. Now, how do we do this? So the Indian government basically and the British government, they've been releasing annual tax tabulations since 1922 that allow us to basically shed light on dynamics of incomes at the very top of the distribution. So as a result of these tabulations, we can go back all the way to 1922 to understand what was the share of national income that the top 1% was earning under the colonial rule, for instance. Now, when we do that, we see that in the interwar period, when inequality was the highest, around 1920, 22, the top 1% was earning around 22%, 21% of the national income. Whereas our latest figures for 2022, 2023 suggest that the top 1% earn about 23% of national income. So very clearly, this number is now officially higher than basically what it was under the colonial rule. At the same time, we also track dynamics in wealth inequality. Now, income and wealth are two different concepts, and so we track them separately. For wealth, our series begins in 1961. That's when the government of India started conducting these large-scale surveys that collect information on household assets, debt, etc. We combine that with some information on Forbes billionaire list for recent years, and once again, what we find is that the top 1% has access to about 40% of the national wealth. That's a pretty staggering number, just if we look at it in absolute terms. So yes, that's the main finding. And the point is that inequality has been soaring since about the 2000s. And since, in the last decade, we particularly see top-end inequality, that is inequality within the top 1%, rising much faster than even before.
Sorry, talk a little bit about this idea that the middle class, I was struck by this when I was going through your paper. The middle class has always been the growth engine of India, the demographic dividend, the industrious, hardworking, innovative Indian that comes from the middle class. One of the points that your paper makes is that it's the middle class, as the inequality rises, that's actually being left behind in access or in terms of percentage of share of wealth. So talk about that, the impact that your paper finds on India's middle class.
So, I mean, I think first, one thing that's worth clarifying is what really is the middle class. So, when we
Yes.
economists say what the
We all identify culturally as middle class,
exactly,
but
and I
of
think
course,
that's a bit misplaced. I think so. I think the way we
yes,
economists try to think. I mean, even for us economists, it's not really clear what the middle class is. First of all, so it's a bit.
yeah,
I mean, it's a bit rule of thumb. The way we do it is that we define um, individuals that lie between the 50th percentile and the 90th percentile in the income distribution as roughly the middle class. Now, what we
okay,
see is that their share of the national income has been declining since the 1980s, both national income and national wealth. And it appears, I mean, of course, let's be clear, the poor in India are very poor. And it's not like, I mean, perhaps economic growth has been happening, things have been getting better, but it's not like they've moved very fast ahead. So that's not what we are saying. But what we are saying is that the top seems to be really eating up the share of the middle as they are getting richer and richer. And so it's really in a sense what in an earlier paper Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty called India's missing middle class phenomenon. So we and that's of course it's an important demographic. It contributes to the economic engine, and so if that's not growing, that's a worrisome sign.
but there are those who would point you towards the 8% GDP. They would talk about India, being the third sort of largest economy by 2027, and they would say that the pessimism in your paper is at odds with all of those data points. Question one. Question two, as somebody in our audience said, all right, there's the billionaire Raj on the one hand, but do you really want to go back to the license Raj? There is now a kind of I would say almost near consensus in the political mainstream that there's no going back to a pre-liberalization era. And your paper actually talks about how inequality was actually coming down till the 1980s, and then it spikes, and as you said, it really begins to soar in the 2000s. So question one, how do your data points reconcile with all the sort of plus point headlines coming out of India on its economy, on its GDP? Question two, what's the alternative? A hark back to socialism?
I think those are good questions. So, firstly, I think looking at the numbers that the government itself is putting out in terms of net national income and GDP, the economy really started slowing down sometime around 2016-17. And in fact, in 2019, which was before COVID, the growth rates of average incomes was just 1.9% compared to 6%, 5% in the years before. So there's been a growth slowdown that I think and I think amongst people that are carefully following the Indian growth story, there is consensus that post 2015, there has been a slowdown in growth rate. So I think Professor R. Nagaraj at IGIDR, who's been following the Indian growth story for, I mean, over 2-3 decades now, he points out that investments have slowed down for over the last decade now. The share of manufacturing and industry in the GDP has been stagnating. Youth unemployment has been rising. So I want to first say that, I mean, perhaps in this year growth has been 7-8%. We don't know, but there has been a clear decline in the growth story starting 2015. So that's point number
So
one.
you don't agree with the data of GDP, or you're saying you're isolating the 8% GDP, you're taking this financial year out of your formulation, and you're making an aggregated assessment of growth since 2015?
Yes, so actually, even in our paper, we don't get into financial year 2023, 2024 because the data was not there by the time we got to it. So in a sense, I'm keeping this financial year out of things, also because the numbers are very preliminary. But besides that, I'm saying for the years before that, I mean, growth has been slow. That's point number one. The second point is, and I think that relates directly to this, I mean, the work that we're doing at the World Inequality Lab. I mean, this question of third largest economy is entirely misleading. I mean, firstly, we need to be looking at what is our GDP per capita. So that already brings you really down. So average incomes. So if I take the national income of India and divide it by the adult population, it works out to something like 2.3 lakhs. That's the average income that an Indian makes. So let's not, beat our chests about it. It's not a very large number. It's less than 20,000 rupees a month. So India still, on average, the average Indian is fairly poor. So we need to look at, these numbers in per capita terms. And then the third point I want to make is that even this per capita number is not so insightful because we don't know how this income is distributed across the population. And I think one statement we make in the paper is that to make this average income of 2.3 lakhs, you would have to be at the 90th percentile. Or in other words, 90% of the Indian population or Indian adults, they earn less than the average income, which is to
Yeah.
say the average income is perhaps a good metric just for very elite welfare. It doesn't really tell us what's happening at the bottom.
Now, your paper reiterates an old argument that Thomas Piketty has often made of a wealth tax or like a kind of super tax. And you actually look at it. This was a pretty staggering figure, and I think we have a graphic slide to match for it, and we'll look at it in just a moment. You talk about what even a 2% tax on the 168 wealthiest Indians, right? What kind of difference that could make? You say that not just would it be more just, it would create additional fiscal space for the government to spend on the social sector, where the government spending should really be. And you say just a 2% tax on the total net wealth of 162 wealthiest Indians could lead to a revenue of 0.5% of national income. I mean, that was, even to a layperson like me who doesn't really understand numbers, that just
Staggering
leapt
number.
out. Can you just talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely. I think that's a staggering number. And I mean, in response to this question, I also want to go back to the previous point, which is, I think I want to reiterate, there's no nostalgia for, for the licensed
License
Raj and
Raj.
for that kind of stuff. Let's be clear there. But I think it's important to know that, there's sometimes a false dichotomy between, governments and markets. We need to find the right balance. We are seeing that in the current form, the current development and growth process that India is following is just really unequal. It's benefiting very few, largely. It might be, so that's the point. The point is not that we need to go back to the old times, but the point is that we need to find ways to make our system more fair, more equitable, our growth story more fair and equitable. Now, in terms of wealth tax, now I think there are two things that our paper puts out. One is, of course, this thing of a super tax on the wealthiest. I'll just get to that in a minute. What we also find is that, there's suggestive evidence in the paper that if we look at the Indian income tax system, the traditional wisdom is that the Indian income tax system is progressive, which means that, if you earn a larger income, you pay a larger fraction of your income as taxes.
Yeah.
But if we look at the Indian income tax system from the lens of wealth, which is to see that if an individual's assets increase, what happens to how much tax are they paying? That might actually be falling as we go up the wealth distribution. So, which suggests that the Indian income tax system perhaps needs a restructuring such that we also account for wealth and we also tax wealth in some way, particularly at the top of the distribution. Now, to get to your point, and in that line, we say that, for instance, if we just tax the richest, the wealthiest 162 families, we just put a super tax of 2%, that would get us 0.5% of national incomes in revenues. Now, that's, of course, a staggering number. And that number comes from the fact that the net wealth of these 162 wealthiest families is as large as 25% of the national income. So that's where this number is essentially coming from. Now, the point is, it's not just taxing for the sake of taxing. The point is that India really is a sort of underspender when it comes to key areas like health, education, nutrition, where we really need to, enhance perhaps massive investments. And so this kind of tax on the very rich will, of course, be a way to fight inequality, but also will create fiscal space for these investments that we are arguing for.
Now, I have just a couple of minutes left. So let me take one of the questions that came in on our live stream, which I thought was quite interesting, which says that in a pie that is becoming, I beg your pardon, in a pie that is becoming larger at a rapid pace, a slice that is smaller may also be becoming bigger at a faster pace. So isn't it better to graph, the better graph to plot is the trend of income of a section of population?
So, I mean, we actually do this. So what the reader is trying to say is how has the growth rate of incomes been at different points of the distribution? That's essentially what the reader is getting at, and we do have a graph that goes to this. I think maybe figure 17 or figure 18 in the paper, and we show that it's basically at the bottom. For instance, if you look at incomes for the bottom 80-90%, growth rates are something between 25. 30-35%, and then at the top it can be as high as 100%. So the incomes at the top are growing very fast. So the pie is growing, and the slice that's going to the top is also growing. It's not the other way around.
Got it. One more question from the audience. If we put more tax on the wealthiest, they'll just leave the country. They'll buy property in Dubai. They'll buy themselves a Singapore nationality, which has less tax, and we won't get what they pay already. I think that's a fair question.
I mean, exactly. I mean, I think there's some humor there, but there is some truth to it that humans respond to incentives. So that's a concern. But I think global evidence suggests that this worry is a bit overstated. All the money just doesn't fly away instantly. People have reasons to keep money in a certain country, and so we need to evaluate how much of that is a concern. And if it's not so much of a concern, then perhaps implementing this tax would be the more efficient thing to do.
Okay, Anmol, before we let you go, if there's just one thing you'd want people to know about your report, maybe use it as a starting point for a larger conversation, apart from the very, very catchy, dramatic headline about Billionaire Raj making India more unequal than the British colonial Raj, what would it be?
I mean, I think India, the Indian population in general, and particularly the urban elite, really needs to come to terms with the fact that we are an unequal nation. I think we remain in denial. The very rich tend to think they're the middle class, which is really not the case. And I think that's the first step. I think people, as a nation, we need to come on a common agreement that this is a problem. And I think that will enable us to, make some push with the political sphere to sort of fix this problem.
Well, certainly the arguments made by all of you have started a debate. A number of people in our stream are saying, where's the paper? Where's the paper? So we'll attach a link. You can download the paper. The paper is open. It's open access. You can read the paper, make up your own mind, and generate your own debate. We'll have to leave it there. Professor Anmol Somanchi, thank you so much for talking to us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Barkha.
Thank you.
Mojo Story has always made a commitment to its viewers to go to where the story is. And as you can see here, we are at the epicenter of the Israel war on Gaza. We are right at the front line, about 1 mile from the Gaza Strip, as the Israeli military gets ready with its tanks and its gunners to begin its final frontal assault that will take troops into Gaza. As we said, we are not like other organizations. We believe in giving you all sides of the story objectively and as much as possible from the ground. And that's exactly what we're doing here, covering the biggest global story today from the epicenter of the war zone. So please, we need your support. Support us, become a Mojo member, subscribe to us, spread the word, and thank you for your support.